Rich kid keyed black man's car in front of witnesses. Man hadn't said a word, just smiled. The key bit into the driver's door with a sound like tearing fabric, dragging a long silver scar across 15 years of careful upkeep. Nathaniel Cole stood 20 feet away near the clubhouse entrance, coffee cup in hand, and watched the whole thing happen without moving. Connor Ashford didn't even glance around first. He dragged the key the full length of the door, then the rear panel, laughing softly to himself, clearly certain that whoever owned this tired old Honda Accord parked in the members' overflow lot had no business being anywhere near Brookhaven Golf and Country Club in the first place. A small cluster of guests near the valet stand had gone quiet, watching, phones slowly rising. "Excuse me," a woman finally called out. "Young man, that's not your car to touch." Connor turned unbothered, tossing his keys once in his palm. "Relax. It's probably staff parking. Nobody important drives something like this." Nathaniel set his coffee down on the low stone wall beside him and walked forward, unhurried, his expression giving away nothing at all. Connor's eyes flicked toward him. An older black man in a plain gray jacket, no country club polo, no obvious sign of membership. And something in Connor's posture relaxed even further, mistaking the calm approach for confusion rather than what it actually was. "This your car?" Connor asked, almost bored. Nathaniel looked down at the long silver gash running the length of the door, then back up at the young man still holding the key that made it. He said nothing. He simply smiled. A small, quiet, unreadable smile that made the woman near the valet stand lower her phone slightly, suddenly unsure whether she'd just witnessed the beginning of a confrontation or something else entirely. Nobody in that parking lot yet understood exactly what that smile meant, but by the end of the week, every single one of them would. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's go back a little further to understand exactly who Nathaniel Cole really was. Nathaniel Cole had spent 40 years building things quietly, the same way he did almost everything, without fanfare, without needing anyone in the room to notice. He'd grown up outside Pittsburgh, the son of a steel mill machinist and a schoolteacher, raised with a simple family philosophy passed down from his grandfather. Work hard, stay humble, and never let your success change the way you treat the people who have less than you. Nathaniel took that lesson seriously through every stage of his life. He'd worked his way through engineering school on scholarship and night shifts at a hardware store, eventually founding a small industrial parts manufacturing company in his early 30s that grew, slowly and steadily over 3 decades, into one of the largest privately held suppliers in the country. He was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily wealthy. Very few people who met him casually would ever guess it. Nathaniel still drove the same 15-year-old Honda Accord he'd bought used the year his company crossed its first $1 million in annual revenue, a small private reminder to himself of exactly where he'd started. He wore the same handful of plain jackets to most meetings, reserving the expensive suits for the rare occasions that truly required them. He believed, deeply and unshakably, that the way a person treated someone who could do nothing for them said more about their character than almost anything else in life. His wife of 31 years, Eleanor, had passed away 2 years earlier, and since then, Nathaniel had thrown himself even more fully into the philanthropic side of his work, funding scholarships for first-generation college students, quietly covering medical debt for families he'd never meet, always insisting his name stay off the paperwork whenever possible. That Tuesday afternoon, Nathaniel had driven out to Brookhaven Golf and Country Club not as a member, not as a guest looking for a round of golf, but for a private meeting with the club's general manager. Daniel Whitfield regarding a confidential business matter that neither man had yet discussed with anyone else on the property. Nathaniel had chosen, deliberately, to arrive in his old Accord rather than any of the newer vehicles sitting in his garage at home. It wasn't an accident. It never was with Nathaniel. He'd learned, over 4 decades of business, that the way people treated a man in a worn gray jacket driving a modest car told him almost everything he needed to know before a single word of negotiation ever began. He had no idea, walking toward the clubhouse that afternoon, exactly how much that instinct was about to be confirmed. Connor Ashford was 19 years old, the only son of Richard Ashford, a prominent local real estate developer and one of Brookhaven's longest-standing board members. And in 19 years of life, Connor had rarely encountered a consequence that actually stuck. He'd been suspended twice in high school for incidents his father's attorney had successfully argued away both times. He'd totaled 2 cars before turning 18, both replaced within the week, without so much as a serious conversation about the cost. He'd grown up understanding, on some deep and largely unexamined level, that the rules other people lived by simply didn't apply the same way to a family with the Ashford name attached to it. At Brookhaven, Connor had developed a particular habit that the staff quietly tolerated because complaining about Richard Ashford's son carried obvious professional risk. He liked identifying which vehicles in the parking lot didn't belong, a private little game rooted in assumptions about who deserved to park where, and he'd never once in 3 years of this habit faced any real pushback for it. He'd keyed 2 other cars before this one. A modest sedan belonging to a longtime groundskeeper's visiting daughter, and an older pickup truck owned by a contractor completing renovations to the clubhouse kitchen. Both incidents had been quietly absorbed by the club's insurance and staff goodwill, neither owner willing to risk their livelihood by pushing back too hard against the Ashford family's influence. Connor had learned from all of it exactly the wrong lesson: that this behavior carried no real cost, that his father's name and money would always smooth over whatever mess he left behind. Nathaniel Cole's tired gray Honda Accord, parked slightly crooked in the overflow lot that afternoon, had struck Connor as exactly the kind of vehicle that didn't belong at Brookhaven, an assumption built entirely on the car's age and a fleeting glimpse of the man walking toward the clubhouse in a plain jacket rather than a member's polo. He had no idea that the man he'd just humiliated in front of a dozen witnesses was, at that very moment, walking into a private meeting that would determine the financial future of the very club Connor believed made him untouchable. He had no idea, tossing his car key back into his pocket and walking away with a satisfied smirk, that his father's standing at Brookhaven was about to become a great deal less secure than either of them currently understood. The meeting inside the clubhouse's private conference room began just 12 minutes after the parking lot incident, and Daniel Whitfield, Brookhaven's general manager, noticed immediately that something about his guest's demeanor had shifted, though Nathaniel gave no outward sign of what had just happened outside. "Mr. Cole," Daniel said, extending a hand, "thank you for coming out. I know you could have had us come to your offices instead." "I like seeing a place firsthand before I commit to anything," Nathaniel said, shaking his hand warmly, settling into the chair across the table. "Helps me understand exactly what I'd be investing in." The 2 men spent the next 40 minutes discussing the confidential matter that had brought Nathaniel to Brookhaven that afternoon. The club's parent hospitality group, struggling under significant debt after an ambitious expansion 3 years earlier, was quietly seeking a controlling investor to stabilize its finances before the situation became public and damaged the club's reputation among its wealthy membership base. Nathaniel's firm had been identified, through a discreet financial advisory process, as the most viable candidate. Not because he had any personal interest in golf, but because his firm's reputation for careful, principled stewardship of struggling businesses made the current ownership group trust him more than any of the other, flashier offers on the table. "I'll be direct with you, Daniel," Nathaniel said. "If this deal moves forward, I'm not interested in being a silent partner. I'll want a genuine say in how this club treats its staff, its guests, and honestly, its own members when they step out of line. Money alone has never impressed me. Character does." Daniel nodded slowly, sensing something behind those words that he didn't yet have context for. That's very much in line with what our board is hoping for, Mr. Cole." "Good," Nathaniel said, "because I have a feeling I'm about to have an interesting example to bring up, sooner rather than later." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, but before he could ask what Nathaniel meant, a knock came at the conference room door, and the head of security, a soft-spoken man named Marcus Bennett, stepped inside looking visibly uncomfortable. "Sorry to interrupt," Marcus said. "Mr. Whitfield, we've got a situation in the overflow lot. Vandalism caught on camera. I think you're going to want to see this footage right away." Nathaniel glanced toward Daniel, his expression still carefully composed, though something in his eyes had sharpened considerably. "By all means," Nathaniel said. "I'd very much like to see it too." The security footage played on a small monitor in Marcus Bennett's office. 3 of them gathered around it in silence. Daniel Whitfield, Marcus, and Nathaniel, standing calmly a step behind them, watching his own car get keyed for the second time on the small screen with an expression that revealed nothing at all. "That's Connor Ashford," Marcus said quietly, pausing the footage on a clear frame of the young man's face. "Richard Ashford's son. This isn't the first time, Mr. Whitfield. I flagged 2 similar incidents last year, but—" He stopped himself, glancing uncomfortably toward Daniel. "But nothing happened," Daniel finished for him, his jaw tightening. "Because of who his father is." "That's about the shape of it, sir," Marcus admitted. Daniel turned toward Nathaniel. His expression caught somewhere between professional mortification and genuine concern. "Mr. Cole, I am so deeply sorry. That car in the lot. I didn't realize—" "It's mine," Nathaniel confirmed simply. 15 years old. Bought it used the year my company hit its first $1 million in revenue. I still drive it most places. I don't strictly need to impress anyone." Daniel's face shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Surprise, embarrassment, and finally, a dawning understanding of exactly how badly this afternoon had gone for a young man who had no idea whose vehicle he'd just damaged. "I'll have him and his father brought in immediately," Daniel said. "This is completely unacceptable, and I promise you, Mr. Cole, it will be handled properly this time." Nathaniel held up a hand gently. "Actually, Daniel, I'd like to request something a little different, if you're willing." Daniel paused. "Of course, whatever you need." "Don't tell them who I am yet," Nathaniel said. "Let's see how this plays out first. Exactly the way it would have played out for anyone else who didn't happen to be sitting across the table from you discussing a controlling investment in this club. I want to see what kind of place I might actually be buying into." Marcus and Daniel exchanged a brief, uncertain glance, but neither man argued. There was something in Nathaniel's calm, deliberate request that made clear he'd already thought several steps ahead of both of them. "Understood," Daniel said finally. "We'll bring them in exactly as we normally would." Nathaniel nodded once, the same small, unreadable smile from the parking lot returning briefly to his face. "Good," he said quietly. "Let's find out exactly what Brookhaven has been tolerating." Richard Ashford arrived at the clubhouse 40 minutes later, still in his golf attire, visibly irritated at being pulled off the back nine for what he clearly assumed was a minor, easily resolved inconvenience. "Daniel," Richard said, striding into the manager's office with the particular confidence of a man used to conversations going his way. "What exactly is this about? My assistant said something about the parking lot." "Your son keyed a member's guest's vehicle this afternoon," Daniel said evenly. It's on camera. Clean, unambiguous footage. Richard waved a hand dismissively. Connor's a good kid. If something happened, I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. Boys get restless out here. You know how it is. There's also a pattern, Marcus said quietly, stepping forward with a folder in hand. 2 prior incidents flagged last year, both involving staff and contractor vehicles. Neither was formally addressed at the time. Richard's expression tightened slightly, though his confidence didn't waver. I don't recall hearing about any of that. And frankly, if it's just cosmetic damage to some old car, I'm happy to write a check right now, and we can all move on with our afternoon. That's a generous offer, came a calm voice from the doorway. Richard turned, finding Nathaniel Cole standing there in his plain gray jacket. The same unhurried composure he'd carried through the entire parking lot incident still very much intact. And you are? Richard asked, a faint note of dismissal already creeping into his tone. Nathaniel Cole, he said simply. It's my car your son damaged this afternoon. Richard's expression shifted, recalibrating slightly, though not yet with any real concern. Mr. Cole, I apologize for the inconvenience. As I said, I'm happy to cover whatever repair costs are involved. I appreciate that, Nathaniel said, but I don't think a check quite addresses the actual problem here, do you? 2 prior incidents, quietly absorbed, no consequence, no conversation with your son about why targeting vehicles he assumes don't belong is something worth examining a little more closely. Richard's jaw tightened. With respect, Mr. Cole, I don't think you fully understand the situation. My family has supported this club for over 2 decades. I don't appreciate being lectured about my son by someone I've never even met before today. Nathaniel held his gaze steadily, that same small smile returning, quiet and entirely unbothered by Richard's rising irritation. No, Nathaniel agreed softly. You don't understand the situation yet, but you're about to. The room fell into an uneasy silence, Richard Ashford's confidence visibly faltering for the first time as he studied Nathaniel more closely, sensing something in the room's dynamic that he hadn't accounted for. I'm sorry, Richard said slowly. Have we met before? You seem to think you're owed some kind of explanation from me, and I still don't understand why. Daniel Whitfield cleared his throat, glancing toward Nathaniel as if seeking permission before speaking. Nathaniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Richard, Daniel said carefully, Mr. Cole is here today finalizing terms on a controlling investment in Brookhaven's parent hospitality group. As of this afternoon, pending board approval next week, he'll hold majority ownership of this entire club. The color drained slowly from Richard Ashford's face, the full weight of the last 10 minutes rearranging itself into something far more serious than a simple parking lot mishap. I wasn't aware of any pending sale, Richard said, his voice noticeably smaller now. Very few people are, at this stage, Nathaniel said calmly. Confidentiality is standard in deals like this, but I imagine you'll be hearing quite a bit more about it very soon. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly searching for some version of the conversation he could still steer back toward familiar ground. Mr. Cole, I assure you, whatever happened today has nothing to do with the club's overall culture or values. My son made a poor decision. It happens. Teenagers make mistakes. It's happened 3 times, according to Marcus's records, Nathaniel said. That's not a mistake, Richard. That's a pattern. And a pattern that's been quietly protected because of your name and your checkbook is exactly the kind of culture problem I mentioned to Daniel less than an hour ago, before I even knew your son was involved. Richard's jaw worked silently for a moment, the reality of his position shifting rapidly beneath him. What is it you want? Richard said finally, his voice tight. An apology? Compensation? Name it. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, His voice carried none of the anger Richard clearly expected, only a steady, unwavering clarity. "I don't want anything from you personally, Richard," Nathaniel said. "What I want is for your son to understand, clearly and directly, exactly what his actions cost. Not in dollars, but in consequence. That's not something a check can fix. And I want this club's board to understand, before I finalize anything, exactly what kind of culture I'd be signing on to change." The formal club board meeting convened 4 days later, and word of Nathaniel Cole's pending investment had, by then, spread quietly through Brookhaven's tightly knit membership circle, though the full story of the parking lot incident remained largely contained to those directly involved. Richard Ashford arrived early, visibly tense, having spent the intervening days attempting, through several increasingly uncomfortable phone calls to Daniel Whitfield, to smooth over what he now understood was a far more serious situation than he'd initially grasped. Nathaniel arrived precisely on time, dressed, for the first time since the parking lot incident, in a well-tailored suit rather than his usual plain jacket. A deliberate choice, Daniel suspected, meant to signal that today's meeting carried a different kind of weight than their first conversation had. The board members, 12 in total, took their seats around the long conference table, several of them glancing curiously between Nathaniel and Richard, sensing an undercurrent in the room that hadn't been fully explained to them yet. "Before we discuss the terms of the investment," Nathaniel began, once the meeting was formally called to order, "I think it's important that this board understand exactly what I witnessed during my very first visit to this property." He described the parking lot incident plainly, without embellishment, without visible anger, simply laying out the facts, the pattern of prior incidents Marcus Bennett had documented, and the club's history of quietly absorbing the consequences rather than addressing them directly. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman, a longtime member named Charlotte Reyes, spoke up first. "Mr. Cole, I want to be honest with you. I've heard whispers about incidents like this for years. I never pushed harder because, frankly, the Ashford family's financial support has felt too valuable to risk alienating." "That's precisely the culture I'm concerned about," Nathaniel said. "A club that values one family's checkbook over the basic dignity of its staff and guests isn't a club I'm interested in investing in, regardless of how profitable the golf course itself might be." Richard, seated near the far end of the table, finally spoke, his voice tighter than usual. "Mr. Cole, if this is about punishing my family for my son's mistake, I think that's an overreaction that hurts this entire club's financial future, not just mine." "It's not about punishment, Richard," Nathaniel said evenly. "It's about accountability. There's a difference, and I think, deep down, you understand exactly what that difference is." He turned back toward the full board, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Here are my terms," Nathaniel said. "I will finalize this investment, on schedule, on the condition that Brookhaven implements a formal, transparent incident reporting policy, one that applies equally to every single person on this property, regardless of their family name or their membership tenure. I want an independent review of every, previously unaddressed, incident in Marcus Bennett's files. And I want Connor Ashford to personally apologize to every individual whose property he damaged, in person, along with appropriate restitution determined by an independent process, not a private check written to make the problem quietly disappear." The room went completely silent, the weight of Nathaniel's terms settling over the table. Richard Ashford sat very still, his earlier bravado entirely gone now, replaced by the sinking realization that the influence he'd relied on for over 2 decades had finally, decisively, run out of room to maneuver. The board voted unanimously to accept Nathaniel's terms, Richard Ashford himself ultimately casting the deciding vote in favor after a tense, extended silence that stretched nearly a full minute before he finally raised his hand. "For what it's worth," Richard said quietly, once the vote concluded, I think I've known for a while that I wasn't handling this the right way. I just didn't want to admit it." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, though his conviction remained entirely unchanged. "That's a start, Richard," Nathaniel said. "It's not everything, but it's a start." The independent review of Marcus Bennett's files, conducted over the following 6 weeks, confirmed not only the 2 prior incidents involving Connor, but uncovered a third the family had never even been aware of. A groundskeeper's toolbox, deliberately damaged the previous summer, quietly written off as routine wear and tear, rather than reported for what it actually was. Connor Ashford, faced for the first time in his life with a consequence his father's name and money couldn't simply erase, met individually with each affected party, including the groundskeeper's daughter and the contractor whose truck he'd damaged, offering apologies that felt, according to those who witnessed them, genuinely uncertain and unpolished in a way that suggested real discomfort rather than rehearsed performance. He completed 40 hours of community service at a local youth center, a condition the review board added after learning, through a conversation with Nathaniel himself, about the scholarship programs Nathaniel had quietly funded for years. A suggestion that the young man spend time around kids who had considerably less than he did, and understand firsthand what genuine hardship actually looked like. Nathaniel's own car was repaired the following week, the long silver scar disappearing beneath a careful, professional paint match that left no visible trace of what had happened. Though Nathaniel, when Daniel Whitfield offered to have the vehicle detailed to an even higher standard than before, declined with a small, familiar smile. "It's fine exactly as it is," Nathaniel said. "I've never needed it to look impressive, just needed it to keep running honestly. Same as most things worth keeping around." 3 months after the investment finalized, Nathaniel returned to Brookhaven for the club's newly instituted quarterly accountability review, a public session, open to all members, where incident reports, resolutions, and policy updates were shared transparently, rather than quietly absorbed behind closed doors. Charlotte Reyes, who had become an unexpectedly vocal advocate for the new policies since that first-tense board meeting, opened the session by reading a brief summary of the changes implemented over the previous quarter: clearer reporting, channels for staff, an independent ombudsperson position, created specifically to handle complaints involving influential members, and a noticeable shift, staff quietly reported, in the overall atmosphere around the property. Nathaniel sat near the back of the room, deliberately avoiding the head table, watching the meeting unfold with quiet satisfaction. Near the end of the session, Connor Ashford, now noticeably more subdued than the confident young man from the parking lot 3 months earlier, stood up unprompted from his seat beside his father. "I wanted to say something," Connor said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I spent a long time thinking certain rules just didn't apply to me. That's not an excuse. It's just honest. Working at the youth center this summer, meeting kids who work twice as hard as I ever have for half of what I've always had handed to me, it changed how I think about a lot of things. I'm not asking anyone to forget what I did. I just wanted this room to know I'm trying to actually be different. Not just sorry I got caught." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Marcus Bennett, seated near the front, gave a small, genuine nod of acknowledgement. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition, which felt, in that particular moment, like precisely the right response. Nathaniel watched the exchange from the back of the room, and when Daniel Whitfield glanced back toward him afterward, Nathaniel offered the same quiet smile that had confused an entire parking lot of witnesses 3 months earlier, no longer unreadable this time, but simply, plainly, a small expression of hope for exactly the kind of change he'd insisted on from the very beginning. That evening, driving home in his old Honda Accord along the familiar back roads outside Pittsburgh, Nathaniel found himself thinking, as he often did, about his grandfather's simple philosophy. Work hard, stay humble, and never let your success change the way you treat the people who have less than you. He thought about how easily that parking lot incident could have ended differently. A raised voice, a demand for an immediate apology backed by obvious wealth and influence, a version of justice delivered through intimidation rather than patience. He'd chosen, instead, to simply smile and let the truth of the situation unfold in its own time, trusting that character revealed itself most clearly not in the heat of a single confrontation, but in what people did once the full weight of consequence finally arrived. His phone buzzed with a text from Daniel Whitfield as he pulled into his driveway. "Marcus just told me 2 more staff members filed reports today. Both minor, both handled properly through the new process within the hour. Real change, Nathaniel. Thank you for pushing for it." Nathaniel smiled again, this time simply to himself, alone in his car in his own driveway, and typed back a short reply before heading inside. "That's not thanks to me. That's thanks to a room full of people finally willing to hold the line. I just made sure they had the room to do it in." He set his phone down, stepped out of his car, and looked back once at the long, faint line where the paint had been carefully repaired. Invisible now to anyone who didn't already know exactly where to look. Some things, he thought, healed cleanest when you gave them room, patience, and the truth, instead of rushing to cover them over. So tell us, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done if you were standing in that parking lot, watching Connor key Nathaniel's car? Do you think Nathaniel's quiet approach was the right way to handle it? Or would you have confronted Connor directly in the moment? And what did you think of Connor's apology at the end? Let us know your favorite moment down in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet patience can carry more power than any raised voice ever could. We'll see you in the next story.